Estamos aqui mais uma vez para o nosso tempo de debate. Eu vou falar em português, depois eu falarei em inglês. Temos aqui a presença do professor Ron. So I will switch to English so that he will understand. So we have here the honor, actually, to have Ron Lesthaeghe here. I will give a small, short bio about Ron Lesthaeghe. Of course, everyone knows him, but it's always good to remember what he has done so far in his career. So Ron Lesthaeghe is an emeritus professor of demography, social science, and research methods at the Free University of Brussels. Lesthaeghe is a sociologist and demographer, and is most known for his work on fertility transition in Europe, demography in Sub-Sahara African, marriage and fertility patterns, the Muslim minorities in Europe, and he has done a lot of work also on formal demography modeling on fertility, postponement, and recuperation. The most recently for his theoretical and empirical work is the well-known second demographic transition in Europe, in US, in Latin America. He's born in Ostend, Belgium, graduated from a State University of Ghent, Belgium, and Brown University. He was a member of the European Fertility Project at Princeton. He is a member of the Royal Academy of Brussels and foreign member of the Dutch Academic and American Philosophical Society. He has also been a visiting professor in the US at the University of Michigan, Harvard, and University of California at Irvine. He won the Irene Taueber Awards of Social Demography, the quinquennial John-Ernest Solvay Award in Social Sciences and Humanities in Belgium, and Lifetime Award of International Union for Scientific Study of Population, IUSSP. So it's quite an honor to have you here. I was a former student of Ron. I learned demography a lot from him. I'm still learning from him, Ron. So I will open your presentation and you have the floor to present when you want. I just needed to adjust a little bit here. I'm not seeing. Just a moment. I will open the presentation. Let's see if it goes now. There we go. So feel free, take the time you want, present as long as you want.
Okay. I can't see, of course, the audience, but welcome everybody on my talk on the second demographic transition. And I would, of course, like to thank Everton for organizing this little video conference. I have prepared a number of slides, and in fact, I've called it a trilogy because I'm going to split it into three parts. The first part is to give you, but very quickly, a historical overview of how the theory came about and what we borrowed from other theories in the social sciences, basically two. And in the second part, we will be looking at how we can look at fertility. And in the third part, we will be looking at cohabitation. So we're going to start now with the next slide on the origins of the second demographic transition. In fact, there's a little, next slide, please, yes. We have to make a distinction between the first and the second demographic transition. Obviously, the first one is well known to all of you. It's the historical decline in mortality and fertility. But in the 60s and the 70s, everybody, including me, of course, as a young demographer, we all expected that we were going to coast towards a population very close to the stationary population model with zero growth, except for migration, but zero natural growth, with life expectancies above 70, and with total fertility rates fluctuating possibly around 2 children. And also in terms of the family, William Good prophetized that we were all, the whole of the world was moving towards a nuclear conjugal family in the West as industrialization and urbanization were taking on. So this was what we had in mind in the 1970s. But later on in the 70s, Dirk van der Kar and I thought, well, this may be a bit too optimistic. And so we imagined another model, and that was called then the second demographic transition model by accident. I'll tell you in a minute why this was by accident. But what we predicted then was a systemic sub-replacement fertility. There's no oscillations around replacement, but possibly oscillations around a level that could be well beyond a replacement level. We expected a decline in marriage. Marriage would still be the norm, would still be acceptable, of course, and possibly the dominant mode of living together. But we envisaged, of course, also an increase in premarital cohabitation. And not only in premarital cohabitation, but also a decline in remarriage and in post-marital cohabitation of divorced persons and of widowed persons. We expected more divorce, more singlehood, and postponement of marriage, but also postponement of fertility, that being part, of course, of why we expected replacement fertility to take on hold in these populations. That, of course, has extra consequences, because with sub-replacement fertility, the aging at any given level of mortality is going to be worse because of the shrinkage at the bottom of the pyramid. So percentage-wise, the head of the pyramid is becoming heavier, and that has a number of economic consequences as well. And if there is no migration, if you have a low sub-replacement fertility, then that correlates, or that is the same as saying that the intrinsic growth rate of the population is going to be negative. And just to have an idea, if you have a total fertility rate of 1.5, then the intrinsic growth rate is minus 1%. And if you have a population without migration, a closed population that is shrinking at minus 1% a year, then you have lost half of your population in 70 years. So things go exponentially in the negative way, but quite fast. What was actually the inspiration that Dirk and I had when we were thinking in the late 1970s actually, but we wrote the paper in the early 1980s and was published in 86. But we were both sort of thinking back to two sources. The first one, that is, we were both impressed by the book by a French historian, Histoire de la Mentalité, the famous French school of looking at the cultural aspects in history, Philippe Ariès. And Philippe Ariès had written this masterly volume, L'Histoire de l'Enfance, the history of childhood. And this history in that book leads or follows an upward trend towards more and more respect and more caring for children. The welfare and the quality of life for children would improve over the centuries. And at the end of that period, he says, well, this is the period, the era of l'enfant roi, of the king child. But what he said then in the next paper, in a small paper at a conference, is this era has come to an end. There's no, the child will of course remain very important, but there's no further increase in the same direction anymore. Instead, there's more and more shift towards an attention to the adult, to the adult, his or her own life. And a child is not necessarily anymore to make a couple complete as it was in the past. So that was a very important insight. Actually, there has been another Frenchman who also felt at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, that something was changing. This was Louis Roussel at the INED, at the Institut National d'Études Démographiques in Paris. And also with Louis, we had a discussion and we all three agreed, Philippe Ariès was not there then, we all three agreed that something was in the making. But we did not quite know how far this would go, or whether it was just a little trend or whatever of a more temporary nature. But by 86, we were convinced that something was going to stay. Incidentally, of course, the other source of inspiration, not so much for Dirk as for me, was Maslow. I've always been impressed by Abraham Maslow's theory, already from when I was a student. And this is the psychologist, an American psychologist, writing in the late 40s and the early 50s. And he had a presentation called The Succession of Needs. What would people value? And he says, well, there is a pyramid, a gradient, and a scale from material to non-material needs. And material needs would be security, survival, food, drink. That would be the very basic ones. And as people get richer, as societies get richer, and as these, through social security measures, pension systems, etc., and as these lower order needs are satisfied, other higher order needs are being articulated. And these have to do with expressive forms of being yourself, emancipation, self-realization, and especially, and that's the very important one, individual autonomy, meaning I will decide what I'm going to do in my life, and no institution is going to dictate that. So that means secularization, that means no longer voting for the same party as my parents did. I will choose myself. It also means choosing the way I want to end my life. You see, it has many, many repercussions also in the ethical side, and we'll come to that also later on in the talk. But the clue here is indeed the growth of individual autonomy as society goes richer. But that is not for every society with the same speed, of course. There is very, very many differences at the speed at which this Maslowian engine seems to be working. But if it works generally in the same direction. So, and then, of course, Dick and I had experienced our lives in the 1960s and all the upheavals in the 1960s. And in the Dutch Calvinist society, which had a fertility of 3 children during the 50s and even the 60s, with all these women staying at home, all of a sudden this was being thrown out. I mean, they had what was called the dollar minas, which were the mad minas, emancipated young women who did not want to listen to the men anymore and wanted to get rid of that male dominance in the society, the real forerunners of female emancipation. And not only that, all these movements of the 1960s indicated that something else was going on. Then, and that especially that authority was going to be was in the deck. Authority was no longer accepted, and secularization, of course, also in Belgium, then really went very, very fast. When I was a kid of 7, 8 years, everybody went to church. Everyone wanted to participate in religious festivals. By the 70s, virtually all gone. There was hardly any leftovers of that traditional religious life that had been so typical for the area of Flanders in which I grew up. So that these 3 things together really meant that we need something else to talk about. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, well, here you have them. 1986, we wrote a piece, 2 demographic transitions. That's me to the left and Dirk to the right. Actually, we were invited to write the introduction to a book volume of Mens en Maatschappij, which is a Dutch sociological journal. And we did write that introduction. And precisely saying what we expected to happen demographically, but we didn't have a title to it. And then in an unguarded moment, I said, well, why don't we call it, is there a second demographic transition? Question mark. Not being too overzealous, but it was a catchy title. And it was not meant to be all that much more than a catchy title. But you can see, so many years, decades later, it is no longer a catchy title anymore. It has become a reality in many parts of the world. Okay, next slide. All right. What did we expect in terms of the SPD to unfold? Well, and here that's an important point. It would spread as a result of structural changes. So often SDT is presented as a cultural theory, and it's both, because that cultural shift is based on a structural one, and that structural one is a mighty important engine. Think of the rising education of men and of women, and especially of women catching up and surpassing men in terms of educational levels. Rising employment in tertiary sectors, rising real household income. These are major motors that drive the Maslowian engine. And then, of course, the cultural evolutions as well, all the emancipation trends, all of them, particularly the gender ones, the ethnic ones, the sexual ones, and freedom of choice, further secularization, and individual autonomy, again, being articulated. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Expectation number 2. We have, at one point, we were aware of it, but we were afraid that this theory was going to be interpreted as a monolithic theory with everything coasting towards exactly the same end. Sort of, teleologically moving towards the same endpoint. And that is, of course, not what we meant. We were very much aware of the fact that there was not going to be a convergence to an endpoint. That there could be similar trends, but at very different paces, with very different mixes, because, of course, the SDT is path-dependent, historically path-dependent, just like the first demographic transition. I mean, in France, in the 18th century, and in Bangladesh, the last 20 years, very, very different transitions by the means in which fertility control was being realized. It's just, 2.5 centuries apart from each other. And the second demographic transition can have a similar time scale. There could be populations, and I'm now particularly thinking about Islamic and Muslim, and Islamic and Hindu populations. It can take a much longer time for the signs of the SDT to materialize. So these things are very much historically path dependent. And the result, of course, is a much greater heterogeneity on the local and on the global scale. So, and it's precisely that what's so interesting in studying the first demographic transition, but also the second one, that is, how historically path dependent are they? And then, of course, you need to know your history in dealing with a particular case, the family organization, the lineage organizations, the basic organizational aspects of society. So organizational sociology and demography and the SDT, they are intertwined and cannot be divorced from each other. The initial reaction, and now I'm talking about the 1990s, to what we had proposed was, oh no, not us, we're not going to have that. We're different. You can really see the groundswell that is the historically path dependency already moving up and saying, no, we're not like we're not little Swedes, or we're not little Dutch, or we're not little French. We are Italian or Spanish or Greek or Romanian, and that's going to be different. Well, we know it's not all that. There are differences, but they're all moving in the same direction. That's, of course, what happens subsequently. And we've been hearing that all along. When I was in Japan in 2001, the reaction was, "Oh no, we are different. There's no way we're going to have cohabitation." But because I asked them, have you ever asked the question of cohabitation? Oh, no. It's a very impolite question, sir. So you can really see the initial reaction, even of colleagues, colleagues, social scientists, was, "Oh, no, we're not going to have that." Well, a little bit later on, 2 years later, a newspaper started asking that question in a survey that the newspaper organized nationally in Japan. And it turned out that a quarter of Japanese girls had been cohabiting for at least a year prior to their marriage. So there we are. Japan was not immune to something that was actually in a patriarchal society, what was anathema in such a patriarchal society. So it's not just a Western phenomenon. We know now that under different forms and with different mixtures, various aspects pop up in the rest of the world. And so you have what you could call partial SDT patterns, because one element or one major element can remain behind. For instance, in Asia, the sub-replacement fertility materialized very early on and is now at an extremely low level. I mean, I'm talking about cohort levels of 1.3 children and period levels of 1.1 children, which is extremely low. But they are going to lag behind in terms of cohabitation because they are typically Asian or patriarchal societies. And then on the other extreme, we have Latin America, who have had a long history of cohabitation with ups and downs and with big differences between population groups and between countries, but not yet sub-replacement fertility until about a decade ago. And then we see that they were coming very close to 2 kids and are now dipping below, at the period level at least, below the level of 2 kids. So if we look at then the developments, we have to make this big distinction, and that's the one I'm generally using. It's a rough one, but it's a very basic one. That is, you need to look at the Far Eastern patriarchal societies, and I just been sketching the evolution right there. In Japan, cohabitation started among the lesser educated, and in China it was just the other way around. It started among the most educated ones, but it tends to spread from bottom up in Japan and from top down in China. And after a while, the social class distinctions will tend to not taper off, but at least become more and more horizontal. So that's typically for the patriarchal societies. And why are they against, or why are they so slow on cohabitation? Their marriages are arranged. Their marriages are typically of the nature where women leave their home to the home of their husband. And they stay within that new household, dominated by their husband. And female autonomy in these societies used to be historically very low, and they have to fight that for the moment, and that's what they're doing. But at least historically, female autonomy was extremely low. And since marriages were arranged in order to make a good match, a mismatch was a drama. Marrying outside your caste in India is a drama. Marrying below your standing, and especially your educational standing in Japan and in China, is a drama. Confucianism is very much about this structuration in society and marrying within your level. And so marriages are arranged as a result of that and to assure that. And individual choice is not accepted. Individual choice will break through these historical arrangements, and cohabitation is based on individual choice. And so cohabitation is anathema in patriarchal societies, at least in the old format. And what we see now is that it is getting through the cracks, but it is emerging, and emerging actually in full force, even in China. But in China, I've now learned of a very specific feature in the Chinese one. I just tell it now. It is there are Muslim minorities in China, and they are located in particular provinces. And there, two Chinese colleagues of mine, Yuxie and his colleague, younger colleague, have discovered in a survey that young Muslim women were cohabiting. And why were they doing that? Because the state has a minimum age at marriage, and the Muslims want to maintain their very young age at marriage, control over women, want to maintain their very young age at marriage, but they cannot get married because of the law. And so what they do, they have arranged cohabitation. It's amazing. Now they're looking at the proportion of women who give birth before the minimum age at marriage. And of course, all the Muslim little populations in China are popping up. So there you see how cohabitation is within an arch patriarchal structure, how cohabitation is being used for a completely different purpose and not based on individual autonomy at all. So this is really something else that has to be added on to the long history of cohabitation in the world. Okay, having said that, for Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean are a completely different story. They're mixed races, that's self-evident. They have long layers of racial, ethnic layering, from the original inhabitants to the European invaders. And each of them had their systems of marriage and cohabitation. Among the black slaves, for instance, marriage was not permitted, and so you had the phenomenon of the visiting union. That is, a woman would live with a man in cohabitation for as long as he contributed to the family income. And when he ceased to do that, he got kicked out. As simple as that. So there we are. That's one type of cohabitation. Another type is found among populations with a simpler stratification. Hunter-gatherers, for instance, in Mexico, in the mountainous areas of the northwest, the northwest, they had cohabitation too, and marriage was a little ceremony at most, because the church would ask it, or they were pressured to get married. But for the rest, most of the time, at age 25, virtually everybody was still cohabiting and nobody was married. And then you have, of course, the more layered, the more stratified original indigenous societies like the Incas or the Mayas, with social classes and very distinct. And if you have a distinct social classification with many layers in it, from slaves to artisans to warriors to priests, and then all the way up to the nobility, then you see marriage has to be controlled so that people marry within their own layer, within their own social group. And if they have that, then that's no longer cohabitation. Then marriage becomes an institution, and a very strong one. And there's no surprise at all that in Yucatan, virtually all the people are getting married. Very little cohabitation, now more. But there used to be very little cohabitation in Yucatan, as compared, for instance, Chiapas or the Sierra de Noroeste, or the Sierra de Nadal. So there you can really see that that there are major differences. And of course, the Europeans brought, both Spanish and Portuguese, the Catholic marriage, and especially the Spanish. Portuguese were much more lenient on that point of view. Also in Angola, they intermarried. In Mozambique, they intermarried much more easily with the local population. So the colonization, the Portuguese and the Spanish colonization, were quite different from that point of view. And all of that, of course, goes into the big melting pot, and that's the historical legacy in the mixed race situation and in the Caribbean situation. Until, of course, we've been seeing that since the late 1970s and early 1980s, cohabitation has been rising in all layers of the population, including university graduates. Then, of course, we have Sub-Saharan Africa, which is yet another story, because Sub-Saharan Africa, not Northern Africa, not the Muslim countries, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Sudan, but Sub-Saharan Africa, they have exogamous marriage. You cannot marry anybody from your own lineage. You have to marry somebody from outside. And so marriage is not a single event. Marriage is between two lineages, and there are exchanges at the various parts of, at various levels, stages of the discussion. So it can go on for 6 months, it can go on for a year, and only at the very, very end, when everybody has agreed that enough exchange in terms of goods and services and God knows what, anything. Cola nuts is the basic, but it can go into a car in more wealthy layers of society. Only when that is settled, then there could be marriage. But in the meantime, of course, nobody stops them from cohabiting. There could be a concubine, somebody who is already married. There could be polygamy, but not all women are necessarily in the same location. There could be what is called a second family in areas where people migrate, like in Southern Africa. So they have a family at home and a family in the place that they are working. So they're basically bigamists, but with children. It's a form of cohabitation. Other forms of cohabitation spring up because they cannot afford to get married. That's simple as that. Or even among the wealthy educated, that is that they refuse to pay these bride wealth payments because they become too exorbitant. They says, no, we are not going to pay that. Chuck the lineages, you know, we are, me and my girlfriend, we are just going to live together without any payments to anybody. So that you can really see how cohabitation is again accommodating a variety of situations. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, we've already got it there. Ready, willing, and able is one way and that one can look at the story. And so you really then bring the conditions together, but you have to specify them. Ready means there is an economic advantage to a new behavior. If there is no advantage, there is no reason for why this behavior would exist. Cohabitation has obvious advantages. It is easily formed and it's easily broken up, and it's more fluent. So there is no harm or less harm in breaking up after a year. That's clearly low exit cost is clearly a big advantage of cohabitation. Willing, that is, there must be a legal or an ethical or a religious tolerance to the new phenomenon. If the law says no, you can, like in some American states, this was the case, not all that long ago, in the southern states, cohabitation was considered not only a sin, but a crime. So in that case, of course, one would expect that that new behavior would not materialize. And ability, in the case of contraception, this is very easy. Various levels of various methods of contraception must be available, etc., etc. In the case of cohabitation, it means, of course, that there must be a legal opening, and there's no legal sanction to cohabitation. So that's as far as ready, willing, and able is concerned. But you can apply that to fertility, to marriage, to cohabitation, to any form of behavior you want to. And ask the question, is behavior X, does it satisfy the conditions of being ready, willing, and able? Actually, ready, willing, and able was the shortcut that Ansel Cole came up with at the end of the European fertility project. And he said, well, it was basically that. There was a big transition in fertility in Europe, given that they were ready. There was an advantage that was being recognized. But at the same time, it's an and. And at the same time, that they were willing, France with its early secularization, and able that the law was following and not stopping the use of contraception, for instance. So that is, how should I say, a quick way of looking at any kind of demographic behavior. Now the question is it economic advantage? Is it ethically permissible? And are there any technical or legal obstacles? Fertility postponement. That's of course a very important one. But again, there are structural and cultural parts of the explanation, and I'll go into that a little bit later on. And then rise in cohabitation I've already dealt with. Next slide, please. Yeah. Conclusion of part one. The globalization of SDT is not finished. I would say it has just started, but it is already moving within the 21st century at a faster pace than it did at the onset. The SDT is heterogeneous. That was very much the same case with the first demographic transition. It's strongly historically path dependent. Very important point. Sub-replacement fertility is now universal in industrialized countries, and many more are joining the family of sub-replacement fertility countries. And the rise in cohabitation follows very much the ethical revolution, and I will document that too. Next slide. Sub-replacement fertility. Here okay, next slide. What are the trends in postponement and the period total fertility? The SDT links to fertility postponement. How do we conceptualize that? And I will propose also a quick and dirty, but a very, very robust measure of fertility with a direct sociological interpretation. That's why I call it the life cycle sensitive total fertility rate. And I will also look at current theories. Current, they're not so current anymore. The theories between 2000 and 2010 that predicted a rise in fertility and the end of sub-replacement fertility. Well, here you see, it's not at all the case. The rise is, here I just plotted the 3 points in 2000, 2010, and then here 2018. But if I would be, this is before COVID, that's why I use 2018. And you can really see in all the countries that above here, all have this inverted U shape. They were all rising, vast majority, except for the USA, vast majority of them had increases in fertility from 2000 to 2010. And that's when a number of very optimistic theories were being formulated. But the ink wasn't even dry, and the theories were faulted. After 2010, all these countries had declining fertility. Here are then a number of other countries that do not follow that trend so far. In fact, Italy does. It has this inverted shape, and Spain does too. So it follows this European pattern, but at a much lower level. But then Austria had continued, but not anymore, fertility increases very slightly. But South Korea, for instance, you can really see it's dipping to 1.1, and Japan must be here, so there too. Here it's flat in Japan, but it's also dipping now quite substantially. But nevertheless, the taking home from that was, well, all these European countries and the many demographers in Europe, many of them thought, Lesthaeghe and Van der Kaas sustained sub-replacement fertility as a structural phenomenon. It may not be true. It may be that we're all bouncing back end of that part of the second demographic transition theory. Well, we were calling the cards too early. It is not what happened. But the fertility postponement, that is a very typical one. Here you have a number. This is the years are not showing in this graph. No, sorry, this is bad. Yeah, well, this is 1986 when we formulated the second demographic transition theory, and here you can really see a number of countries who are in the vanguard in postponing fertility, but they're all dramatically increasing, except for the Eastern Europeans. You see, this is the blue group right here. They only start much later on, around what 2000, something like that. But then also they join the family of postponers, but much later. When I have to remedy that graph, I didn't notice that the time axis was no longer there. Okay, next slide. Well, how do we deal with the fertility and the effect of postponement? Because if you say postponement, that means that you're also hoping that after the age of 30, there will be some catching up that is of foregone fertility before age 30. So what are typical factors that cause postponement? Well, there are a number of structural ones. Social and economic constraints, education, employment, advancing education in that case, uncertainty about unemployment, difficulty about housing, economic uncertainty in general, and I would even say ecological uncertainty. Younger people are very much more aware of what could be in for them on the planet than the older generations, of course. So that would, of course, spur on postponement, together with the Maslowian higher order needs, self-actualization, high aspirations, and especially keeping an open future, not doing anything that will close your future. Marriage will close your future to some extent. You can always divorce, but parenthood will really close your future, because you once a parent, you cannot undo unparenthood. There is no way of undoing that. So if these get accentuated, then also postponement will be a more visible and clearly important phenomenon. And in postponement will reduce overall fertility, of course. And then we're hoping that there's going to be some correction later on. What will help? A number of structural policies, affirmative policies, the gender roles, the balance between family life and work, for instance, through childcare. That's what I say, work-household balance, reducing the opportunity cost of motherhood. All of these will be structural factors that would spur on, that would help recuperation. But the emancipation of gender equity will also do that. If men take up more housework, the number of Scandinavian authors have been stressing that on and on and on. That is the incomplete and the complete gender evolution. Remember, all of that would help with recuperation. And in the balance, that would produce the overall fertility. But it's a question of postponement and recuperation. How do they play off? And we have to follow them on really very closely. Well, life cycle sensitive TFR will provide an answer to that. So we split up fertility, first of all, into the teenage fertility level. That's an indicator of social class disadvantage, certainly in the Americas. In Europe, teenage fertility is extremely low. It's also typical for an incomplete first demographic transition because of low contraceptive use and deficient knowledge of contraception, or deficient accessibility of contraception, youth cultures, early lifestyle experimentation, all of that, of course, are linked to the teenage fertility. And then the age group 20 to 29, that's a starting phase with major transitions to adulthood. All major transitions to adulthood are located in that particular age bracket. The end of education, the start of employment, looking for a partner and partner selection, the focusing of your value system, keeping the future open or closing it. All of that are basic decisions that are being taken in that crucial age group, span between 20 and 29. 30 and 39, that is, you have an enactment and a consolidation of the option and of the lifestyles that you have picked or that have formed, gradually formed during the previous 10 years. And then 40 to 49 is an ultimate correction certainly on fertility with induced, with assisted fertilization. So but every phase of these four has its own social, economic, and cultural determinants. I mean, the youngsters here are living in very, very different circumstances compared to the ones who are here in their 30s. There's 20 years difference between these two groups. So, and there's 20 years difference over time as well, under very different conditions. And so that's why, again, the life cycle sensitive fertility is linked to time as time moves on. No cohort experiences exactly the same events in its history over time. No single cohort does that. It's always different compared to their predecessors. And so there is sensitivity to different policy interventions as well. And so the classic TFR is, of course, a very bad measure because it pulls all these groups from 1 to 4 all together in one artificial pseudo cohort, although these people are experiencing things at very different times and in very different conditions. But we can solve that sorry, that's too quick. Sorry, I'm back. Yeah, thank you. We can solve that very easily. We will take total fertility, the total fertility rate between 20 and 29 and index this at time t. And then we will look at what their contribution was, but to the people who were when still young adolescents, I mean basically teenagers. So that's the fertility 15 to 19, about 5 years before that. And then we add on the fertility during the recuperation period, but only at 10 years later, when these guys are 30 to 39. And then of course 40 to 45 plus at age 15. And so we have these 4 pieces of information. We can stack them on top of each other. And this is what we are going to do in a minute. Okay, next. How good is this life cycle sensitive TFR? Well, I mean, let's first compare. There's a large number of countries in the data bank, in the Vienna Institute of Demography data bank. And Christoph Seemann there was curious what my life cycle sensitive TFR would yield. And so he said, okay, let's look at the cohort TFR and at the period TFR and how good that correlation is. And of course, you can really see there is a slope here. Correlation is 0.77. Period TFR in terms of in periods of postponement are sinking much more, and in terms of catching up, they are the period TFRs are too low compared to the cohort ones in periods of postponement, and you can really see the vast majority of the points are here in the black area and along the dotted line. So this is a very vivid reminder of the distortion of period TFRs due to the shift in timing. But if you look at the real cohort and at the life cycle sensitive one, the correlation is 0.93. It's a very good measure. This very sloppy measure of mine, the life cycle sensitive TFR, is a very, very good approximator of the real cohort TFR. This again came to me as no surprise, but a number of colleagues were very, very surprised that this was actually working that well. And it needs very little data. It needs age-specific fertility rates. In 5-year age groups is okay. 5 years apart is okay, but you have to stack them along the diagonal along the cohort line, the life cycle line, rather than stack them on top of each other in one and the same period, along a period line. That is the worst thing one can do. But then looking at the 5 pieces, as you can see, the 4 pieces, the 4th piece is really not all that important. That's the fertility at above age 40. But here we have France and Sweden. And I've singled out these 2 countries because they are the ones who kept their cohort fertility and also their TFR very, very close to replacement level, all the way through these first 2 decades, 3 decades of the second demographic transition. But what was happening? Well, both of them were postponing. Teenage fertility had dwindled. Also in France, see how European teenage fertility has almost disappeared. And it's basically a play between before 30 and after 30. And this is at time T and at time T then. So it's the same women who are being registered here. You can really see that the postponement is taking place. The contribution of those before 30 is shrinking quite dramatically. It's halving, basically. But in France and in Sweden, it's being compensated by nice recuperation after the age of 30. But we can also only follow this up to the point that these women are 40, and so this blank bit is still to materialize. But what we can see is that at least up till age 30, there's still further declines. So the catching up here has to be even bigger than before in order for this line to be horizontal. Same here, which is not that likely. But I do not know by how much they will the recuperation will neutralize this negative trend or not. That I cannot say. And nobody can say that. Not even any adjustment formulas of whatever kind can say that. This is in the hand of the gods, so to speak, not in the hands of demographers. Okay, next slide. The US and Canada. The US, a very typical case up till the cohort 2006. They still, these cohorts who were then in their 20s reached virtually the two-child level. I mean, that it was so typical for the United States. Canada, this was not the case. I mean, very clear decline. But what we see here is that the younger ones in the United States, after a more modest, almost horizontal line here in terms of postponement, they are now vastly postponing. And the total fertility rate in the US is now, believe it or not, 1.7. If somebody would have told me that 10 years ago, I would have said, yes, it's possible. But if they would have told me that 20 years ago, I said, that would be hard. Knowing a bit about the Northern Americans, well, it is materializing 1.7, and it will probably fall further. Canada, of course, followed much more European phenomenon, massive postponement, but no recuperation to the same extent as the States. That's Canada, yeah. All right, Spain and Italy, that's now the right graph. There you can really see massive postponement in both of these countries, not followed by any, you see, the bars of recuperation here are not all that much bigger than the bars of recuperation right there. Here the bars are in Italy, they are slightly bigger, but by no means enough to bring fertility back to 2, and still dropping off here before age 30. So chances are that this line will also slightly drop off. We do not know how much, but we are now talking not about bringing fertility back to 2 kids, but to 1.5 only. So a little graph like that, and life cycle sensitive look at fertility brings out these phenomena, I think, to quite a clear extent. This can be done, of course, for all Latin American countries because they have all age-specific fertility rates, all by 5-year age groups, all published probably, and all every 5 years. Just arrange them historically over time. Do you want to do it year by year, then you get something like that. When you want to do it 5 years by 5 years, it's a bit rougher, but you will at least see very visually how this sub-replacement fertility and the balance between postponement and recuperation are playing out. Okay, next. Two Asian cases. Dramatic, this is Taiwan, dramatic decline in fertility prior to age 30 and not enough recuperation. And this line is not 1 point, this blue line here is not 1.5 but 1. So you can really see how deep fertility can sink, also in a cohort perspective, not just distorted in a TFR perspective, in a very clear cohort perspective. All right, the next one. So you've seen the inverted V shape of the evolution of fertility in Europe, and they caused optimistic views to pop up prior to 2010. The end of postponement. That's the Thiene-Bongaard's line of thought, would bring back fertility to replacement, or to at least the level of adjusted fertility. That's technically also not even true. What they measure is, if the tempo shift would not have occurred in the past, what would the TFR then be now? But it has no forecasting value whatsoever. So it's a complete misinterpretation to say the adjusted fertility level a la Bongaard's, a la Thiene, or a la any other format of readjustment will predict if postponement stops, to what level of fertility will go back. No way, because it just looks at tempo and has no inkling as to what is going to happen with quantum. And it's also a quantum affair, not just a tempo case. Another one has been in Nature and has produced a lot of reactions in the press internationally. Advancing Human Development, and what they use the UN indicator. Later on they split it up, did a bit better, but it's the same family, of course. Said, well, with advancing human development, fertility will bounce back, but they used a plain cross-section. And then, of course, France and the Western Europeans and the Scandinavians are above the Southern Europeans and the Eastern Europeans. And of course, that correlates with human development. I mean, this has been correlating with human development for the last century or century and a half, virtually. So this was really a case of what Arlen Thornton had labeled as reading history sideways. That is, from a cross-section, a simple cross-section, you infer a whole evolution, a whole history, or a whole evolution to come. So forget that. That's simply not the case. And then, of course, the Scandinavians all came up with a big fanfare, drums and music, and say, but we are the ones who are the only ones who have completed the complete gender revolution. And so they proposed two stages in the gender revolution, and a partial one and a complete one. And the partial one would be where women would take only public jobs equal to that of the men, and the complete one would take also household jobs. Men would take household tasks completely mirrored to the one of women. But and the Scandinavians have very general social security arrangements, paternity leave, maternity leave, high children allowances, creches, you name it. I mean, their layouts are by all means the best in the world still today, but this cannot stop the fertility decline after 2010. And in fact, you know, the Norwegians is 1.5, the Swedes 1.6, the Finns 1.4, 1.3, the Danes also 1.5, 1.6. Also, but also a number of other Western European ones. Belgium is 1.5, the Netherlands, idem dito. Only France is still there at 1.7. So you can really see before COVID, fertility declined again and quite precipitously. And so the theories that now are coming up to explain that decline, many of them deal with insecurity. This seems to be the catchword of the day for explaining the turn of the trend after 1909 or 1910. Okay, next slide. So it's the end of optimism, falling fertility after 2010. The depression is not an explanation, because it's a lasting effect. The effects of depression do not go by or dissipate in a matter of years. And then for that effect of the 2009 depression to hang on so long, that will be unrealistic. Increased insecurity, this is what I said, that is more and more the explanation that many people are offering, particularly in Southern Europe, and that I can understand. I mean, in Italy, this level of insecurity has been plaguing them for a very, very long time, and has been also the reason why they were staying at home and not leaving home until at very, very, very late ages in Italy. This insecurity of the job market, but also now for the northern countries, this is not really an explanation. But could it be insecurity about the ecology? We don't know. So there's quite a bit of room here to come up with explanations as to why there was a downturn after 2010. So these are the additional suggestions to be looking at. And so another thing that one can float as an idea, that is Easterlin produced a theory that explained fluctuations around replacement level. But now we probably will need now theories that also accommodate fluctuations, but not above superimposed on a flat line at replacement level, but on a line way below at the sub-replacement level of fertility. Okay, that's the conclusion of part 2. You can just read it. There's no more to say about it. Okay, next slide. Okay, cohabitation. It's another typical feature of the second demographic transition. Okay, in 1986, we formulated the SDT, and we already knew that in a number of countries, Norway, Finland, and Scandinavians, that cohabitation was taking off. And we were expecting the same to happen and to accelerate in the other Western European countries, my own, for instance, Belgium. But there were also Eastern European ones, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, and then Italy and Poland, where at that time there was absolutely no cohabitation whatsoever. And so we expected that. I mean, their reaction was, oh no, we are different, remember? We won't have that second demographic transition. This was the time that they said that. And as I said, the ink was not even dry, and they were off. They too were having increases in cohabitation. Although quite slowly. I mean, Italy and Poland, two arch-Catholic countries, were quite slow in taking up. But Spain and Portugal, for instance, were much faster in doing so. Okay, next theory. Next slide, sorry. Here we're moving to grounds which are more familiar to all of you. That is the map of cohabiting proportion, percentages, women cohabiting in the age group 20 to 29 as a percentage of all women who are in the union. That is cohabitation and marriage together. So that's the denominator. There's no single people there or divorced. It's just people in the union, couple. This is in 10 years different, 2000 to 2010. And I thank, of course, immensely my colleagues at in Barcelona, and Tony Lopez in particular, for producing this map. We have also earlier maps, but the later one is still coming, of course, 2020 census round. IPUMS also, thank you IPUMS, Minnesota, for archiving all these materials. And of course, in Latin America, the question about cohabitation has been a part of the census as a typical household form category. And so IPUMS is a perfect source for studying that evolution. Okay, let's look at Canada. Oops, sorry. Can we go back to the map? All right. As you can see here in the States, there's no pink whatsoever. In Canada, there is Quebec, and of course, the Inuit populations in the north. They're small populations, but on the graph they are big. And Quebec, but it's only one dark spot left in the United States. You can guess why. It's Mormons living there. Yes, indeed. This is the Mormon state. No red, or not very much visible yet in Mexico, and here in the west it's popping up, and it's Chiapas also. But the parts of the dark blue remain in Yucatan, old Maya country. And in Latin America, you can really see how big a shift there is. From here, the northwestern slice is turning entirely red, but these are, of course, sometimes areas that are not big in terms of population, but that you have to be bearing that into mind. But there is always a blue line here, which is the high Andes in Bolivia, in Peru, and also in Colombia. There used to be a blue spot. Maybe this is the old Inca tradition, or I don't know what to think about it. It sort of cohabitation has a link to height, but I don't really know what the story is behind that. But the blue areas right here in eastern Brazil are all dissipating. It's all much less. And of course, we are going to see a number of countries how this evolution has been continued. Okay, next slide. This is Mexico. Mexico, the IPUMS in Mexico are very interesting because they archived historical materials from Mexico. And Mexico in the 1930s had a census that measured cohabitation and at the same time languages other than Spanish. And so we can also reconstruct, it's not shown here, reconstruct the changes in cohabitation by ethnic group in Mexico. But what we have here is by Mexican states, but starting from the 1930s. And here you see, well, Chiapas, of course, way up, and then all of these high ones decline all the way till about 1980. And then the marriage is at its high points in all, with very big differences, of course. Cohabitation here is still 30% of women 20 to 29, and in here it's not even 5%. So from 5% to 30% is quite a big difference. But here at the starting point, the difference was much larger. But what happens then is everybody starts increasing, and the ones in the middle group here are now at the top, as indicated by the red bracket. So it's a really inverted U-shaped curve. This is the first transition, the demographic transition in Mexico is with an enforcement of marriage. And the second one is a relinquishment of marriage and a revenge of history, an increase in contraception. But not a revenge of history for everybody, because for these guys, cohabitation was very low to start with. And so this is really a novelty for the states who are singled out right there. Okay, next one. All right, now by education, very crucial thing. These are graphs taken from our book. And this is again proportion of women cohabiting as a proportion of all women in the union aged 25 to 29. Panama, you see, is very, very high at the low education group already historically. And it cannot reach 100%. It's almost 100%. But of course, lots of room for increase at the university completed group. That is typically second demographic transition. This is not a POD, a pattern of disadvantage form of cohabitation. Colombia, it's the middle groups who increase most, but the university graduates are participating. They're not the biggest increases, but it stops in 2005. It's the last measurement here. So really would like to see Colombia, the latest lines being added, and I would guess it's something like this, with the university graduates in the neighborhood, getting to the neighborhood of about 60-70%. Brazil, similar thing. The last measurement here is 2010. Everybody participate. The least educated most, the best educated least, but it's not zero, and they may be catching up. In Mexico, I mean, between 2000 and 2010, everybody increased at the same amount. The two lines here are almost parallel, and again, also an increase among the best educated. Next slide. Argentina, and quite an increase here in terms of, it says big an increase from the starting baseline here, as big an increase for university completed as among the least educated. So the difference between these 2 points and these 2 points is almost exactly the same, and this is true for all education categories. But for Uruguay is, I said, Uruguay is like Quebec of Latin America. It's a landslide. Between 1996, which is this line, and 2010, which is the upper line, it is just a big movement towards cohabitation. It's unique. It's really the crisis of the institution of marriage in Uruguay. Going back to ready, willing, and able, let's have a look at willing, at individual autonomy, at areas where individuals want to have a choice themselves over their own lives. Of course, partnership without interference of anybody else is a basic choice of yourself, and of the partner, of course, and of no institution, no parents, no kinship. It's up to you. Well, we have been looking at other issues where it's up to you, but I've turned it around. I'm looking at the reaction against it. That is, what is still never justified or still stigmatized. The length of the bar shows the degree of stigmatization, not liberalization, but the other way around, of stigmatization on a number of ethics items. Homosexuality, abortion, divorce, euthanasia, and even suicide. And they're measured from the World Value Studies from 2005 or later. Sorry, the data are already a bit old, but should be updated. But it's very, very clear what they're talking about. So the length of the bar is the sum of the bars of each of these 5. So the sum is 500. 100% stigmatized, never justified for that, plus 100% never justified that, etc. All the way would give you a total of 500. So there is one who comes very, very close. Jordan, for instance, comes very close and saying everything is never justified. The sum of it would be 500. But we're looking at the bottom. Who is at the bottom? Well, the Nordic countries. I mean, hardly anything is stigmatized. Then come Western Europeans. I have Switzerland, Germany, Netherlands, and France. A little bit less liberal, but hardly any compared to the Scandinavians. Then Italy and Spain are typically a difference between the two countries. Typical difference between the two is also reflected in the degree of cohabitation. Italy is very slow on cohabitation, much lower levels. Spain and Portugal went straight on. Franco regime finished, Salazar regime finished, freedom, cohabitation. Everybody is, but Italy, Catholicism is an Italian religion. It's as simple as that. It's invented in Italy, and it's Italian Roman Catholicism. It says so. Roman Catholicism could be. It's the Italian religion par excellence, and so they stick to it much more clearly than everybody else who is Catholic, including the Poles and the Irish. Then more higher percentages, still stigmatized, never justified, are found in the Anglo countries. New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, USA, Canada, more than the Western Europeans. Less cohabitation also. In the next group, and here we see the historical advantage of the mixed race group. And I'm sorry, this is Eastern Europe, much more conservative, and we know that. This also in terms of abortion, in terms of cohabitation, they are much more conservative than the Western Europeans. They all stick out. Serbia, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. But with a big difference between Bulgaria and Romania. And it's echoed completely in terms of differences in cohabitation. Romania, very little. Bulgaria, almost at Western European levels. Then the ones, of course, are the Latin American ones. Mixed race, Uruguay, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. Not many differences between them. Uruguay is the most liberal one, that's the shortest line here. Colombia, according to this measurement, would be the most conservative one. But as you can see, there are not many differences. But it's very striking again that Uruguay is the more liberal one in the deck, with its spectacular rise in cohabitation. And then come the Asian ones. Japan. Japan has, of course, no dominant religion. It's a mixture. It's a choice. You can mix them. You can mix Confucian elements with Buddhist elements, with older religions that go back to ancestor worship. So Japan is quite a mixture in terms of willingness, and of course it is the most willing for the moment. But who could be following? Thailand is a candidate for the second demographic transition in terms of cohabitation coming up. Marriage in Thailand is also very easy to form. You just need a monk to say that you're married, and it's also easy to divorce. You just name another monk or even the same monk to say that you're no longer a couple. So it's very fluid as well. Then, of course, the big reaction is among the Islamic and the Hindu countries, with Malaysia being the more liberal one as an Islamic country. We don't know to what extent whether Malaysia will be the first one to start an initiation of cohabitation. But all of that are typically countries belonging to a very single dominant religion, prohibiting cohabitation and strengthening patriarchal family and organization. Okay, next slide. So the conclusions: high context specific historical marriage and kinship organization manage a great deal, and also the current ethical revolution, which linked to the previous line, of course, is of major importance. And you have to make a big difference between the patriarchal and endogamous societies, as with the historical background in that organization, the conjugal ones, the European ones, the mixed race ones, Latin American ones, and Caribbean, and lineage and exogamous African, Sub-Saharan African. The starting patterns, the pattern of disadvantage is among cohabitation existing or pre-existing among the poorer, the less educated, is an element, and the SDT pattern manifesting itself now among the better educated as a much more recent phenomenon. And the subsequent development is, it seems that cohabitation diffuses rapidly across all social strata, and so you have a fusion of the pattern of disadvantage and the SDT patterns of cohabitation. And of course, cohabitation is still in different phases. It can be still early courtship. We also know now that it can be a replacement of marriage in these Muslim societies in China who are not allowed to marry at these young ages. It can be an alternative to marriage where people stay, remain as couples, as in a cohabiting union. It can be cohabitation until parenthood and then marriage with parenthood. So these things are all in the evolutionary lines that can be studied in the various societies. Okay, and I think we can conclude now. The rise of cohabitation is following these particular patterns in a more general way. But do look at it in a specific way, with a specific context, with a specific history, with specific anthropology. You will learn a lot about societies in that way. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really amazing. The audience already sent some questions. Myself has a couple of questions as well. I probably will start with mine, and then I will open to you to the questions that I got from the audience. One thing that I was thinking about it is this process that divides between first demographic transition and second demographic transition. And I was thinking about the three components that you described, the coal components, red, willing, and able. And the willing component, cultural acceptance, and you talk about ethics, evolution. But my question is, what will you expect about fertility in the cases that we are now seeing and experience in many parts of the world, Brazil included, this new trend of conservative attitudes towards family? Now we have Italy, for instance, Holland, and also right-wing politic elected. Brazil, we had Bolsonaro last year, and then we had Trump, now Argentina with Milei. So I want to hear from you.
Yeah.
And we also have this new trend of Christian nationalism in some places, like in US. So what we would expect about the near future of fertility developments when we interact with second demographic transition, when we have this bouncing back conservative attitudes? So I want to hear your thoughts about this. Yeah. What can you tell us?
The SDT is provoking a reaction in a number of countries. There's no doubt about that. Hungary is a nationalistic affair. It has nothing to do with second demographic transition. It's just this guy in Hungary. And Hungarian nationalism is incredible, because Hungary is basically a country which has been cut in half after the First World War. And they are very cantankerous about that, and still mad about all the territory that they've lost. Territory which is now in Serbia, in Romania, in Slovakia, and that's a very special one. Poland has just been turning around in the election. And I've seen a map of Poland in terms of voting pattern. And Poland is such a split country. The whole of the West in Poland is solidly pro-European Union, voted for Tusk, against the old regime. And the whole eastern part of Poland is very traditional, much more rural, and they all voted for the old guys. And it's almost cut with a knife, the line between these two territories. It's not a mosaic. It's really Eastern Poland versus Western, the less educated versus the most educated Poland. And of course, the reaction in Poland is among the least educated and the more rural tradition. but it didn't last. I mean, Poland is very much, if you look at the total tally, then the Conservative Party doesn't get to 35 or 40%. All the others who are on the other side are still the majority, 55, 65, 70%. So Poland is not much of a worry as far as I'm concerned. Now then, the American situation is, oh yes, newborn Christians and Trump, newborn Christians and this, and newborn Christians and that. It's a new movement, of course, of people recreating groups of belonging, of support that lacks, that is not provided by any other channel. Early Christianity, I mean, just read a book about the very early 3 centuries of Christianity. Was precisely like that. It was precisely a new group that formed and that looked after each other in adversity. That it was a support group, and they recruited via, how should I say, members, family members, people they knew were brought in who still belonged to the older Roman religion, but were converted halfway to Christianity, and that's where it grew, but as a support group in the first place. And I think that's basically what these new religious groups are all about, and particularly in Brazil. I mean, you have, I mean, they even migrated to Massachusetts. They all got American visas. I mean, in Boston, near Boston, there's a whole group of Brazilians, all belonging to new Christian groups. And in the States, I mean, very, very clearly, most conservative, anti-abortion, and the whole anti-abortion wave in the US is carried by these new Christians. And why in America? Not surprised. Why don't the Europeans have these new Christians? I mean, the Jehovah's don't take off nothing of the sort. It's simply because the state provides so much of the cushioning support that is missing in the United States. The United States is a failed state as far as Social Security is concerned, completely. I mean, Trump, it couldn't be more clear. I mean, Biden tries to mend it a tiny bit, but they're so far behind in terms of creating a social welfare state. Canada is doing much better, of course, but that's the only country in the whole of the Americas along that line. So under dire situations with big social cleavages and stratification, big differences in income, big differences in standard of living, groups of people will seek their own support groups, and of course these new profits may provide that, together with a very conservative ideology, an ideology of security, and so they will be pro-marriage, against divorce, not against divorce, no, because the American preachers liked divorce. They were in serial monogamy. The tele-evangelists, they were all in serial monogamy, but definitely anti-abortion. That's one of the key things, and also against cohabitation. They want proper marriage, etc. How far it will go, I don't know. Korea has a similar. The Moonies in Korea are in a similar line, and they are not liked by the Korean government as a result of that. But they are not politically that strong that they could topple or that they could change the South Korean regime. But again, it's also a movement that sprung out of deprivation, basically. What do you think? I mean, you're much closer to it than I am.
But about South Korea, there's a colleague from the audience. He posted a question about it. He said there's still persistent, very low fertility levels in South Korea. And you discuss a lot about a lot of elements of the second demographic transition. How these things pose together, because it's still a patriarchal country, has lacking of cohabitation or not, how economic questions play a role, and all those elements could explain or not.
Yes, well, I mean, as you know, there are basically two lines that lead into, big lines that lead into cohabitation. One is the pattern of deprivation, which is cohabitation among the poorer people who cannot afford marriage. Cohabitation is, quote unquote, the marriage of the poor people. That's one line. And the other line is, much more recently, the SDT one. That is, it has nothing to do with deprivation. It has to do with individual autonomy of choice. And that, of course, there is a link with the economy, no doubt about it. See Maslow. The richer one society gets, the more important the SDT pattern will become. But that doesn't mean that the POD pattern will completely disappear, by no means. So it's not POD versus SDT. It's both together, because POD very often has a historical root, has a historical basis. Poorer people have always tended to cohabit, unless they were forbidden to do so.
Yeah.
But if they were not explicitly forbidden, then they cohabited. They didn't get married, didn't have the means to marry. SDT means they have the means to marry. Nothing will stop them to have a big feast when they get married. But they want to make the choice themselves and have nobody else interfering. And they will only do so when a number of other requirements are fulfilled. Expectations about what they want to do with life, leisure, consumption, etc., education, work security, etc.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, that's what I was thinking, that these two things are not, it's like you have, it's not linear, it's a linear process, but these two things can coexist together.
Oh, yeah. Oh, forget linearity, the whole thing.
Yeah. One student just posed a question here. João Vitor asked about if polygamy in Sub-Sahara Africans, it's a cultural feature that does not make cohabitation spread in these cultures. So he wants to know if this
I think the existence and the acceptance, of course, a very, very long tradition of polygyny means that any form of couple formation could be acceptable. Polygamy is typically a phenomenon of old men monopolizing a pool of young women. You cannot be polygamous as a young man of 20. You are deprived of a bride at age as a young man of 20, because this polygamous gerontocrat is having monopolized the women for you. You see? So, but nevertheless, it means that there is no notion in Africa that a union should be exclusively formed of one man and one woman bound together and at the exclusion of any other partners. That notion doesn't exist in Africa. And that means, of course, that cohabitation can pop up under so many forms, as a form of a second home, Southern Africa, with migrants. What they call in French a deuxième bureau. It is the rich man has a second office, which is, of course, that is a very nice song in Cameroon. It's in French, and the guy sings, I'm so happy, I'm rich enough to have a second office, to discover that his second office is actually the third office of somebody else. So, I mean, that's a caricature, but it just shows that it is so much more fluent. And actually, even if there is marriage, the process of marriage is not an event. Marriage has always been a dealing and wheeling between two lineages, you see, to come to an accommodation. And it takes organs. You cannot marry within your own lineage. It's just diametrically the opposite of a patriarchal system, which tends to be very strongly endogamous. You marry, the preferred marriage partner in an Islamic country is to marry your cousin. And the preferred cousin is a boy should marry his father's brother, his paternal uncle, daughter. So his female cousin on the father's side. it's endogamy. And why? In order to keep the clan, keep the lineage, keep the family group together, to avoid spreading wealth wildly outside the family. And the more societies are stratified, the more and more you have a shift from cohabitation to marriage and arranged marriage.
Okay. There's a very interesting question posed by a colleague, Alves. He asked something about climate, actually. We have now the COP28 show that humanity is on a disaster path. And he asked something about, what do you think about the influence of climate and environment crisis on further drops in fertility rates that will occur together with increasing in childless and the universalization of secondary demographic transition? Do you think that that's what we would expect?
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it won't have anything to do with second demographic transition as such. It's not the line of the second demographic transition, but it is definitely the line of insecurity that the Italians are referring to in an economic sense, but which may also apply in an ecological sense. I mean, my grandchildren are much more worried about the ecology and their future than I was at this same age. I didn't have any ecological worries, nor many economical worries either. So life is going to be quite different for the new generations. And it may be tough, not only economically, but also dealing with the costs of all the mishaps on the ecological level. They will have vast costs to bear.
I see.
And I can understand a young couple and saying, no, I don't want to put children in this world. I don't know what the future of this child is going to be. It's far too uncertain.
Yeah. I have two questions by my own. One is about recuperation. Do you think that the role of assisted reproductive technology is a new feature of SDT? That's one question. And the second question is about your formula of the life cycle sensitive TFR. That we discussed a little bit earlier. You use the age of 20 to 29 as the benchmark in T time. But I was thinking, if you want to apply in another context, like Latin America, where we see that the fertility from age 15 to 19 and 20 to 24, these two age groups, they are quite close in terms of fertility behavior. So I was thinking if we could adapt the formula.
Or you can tailor-made the life cycle TFR and then have a breaking point at 25 and include from 18 to 25 and before 18 as a separate category. No problem whatsoever. I mean, you can do the same thing every 5 age group and define the limits of the age groups that suits the life cycle best. That's the basic idea. It has to fit basic periods in the life cycle. And in the Latin American case, of course, it's the period 22 to 29 in Europe could be shifted to 18 to 25 in the Latin American situation. I would say, of course, go ahead. That's the idea of the life cycle behind it. As far as your first question is concerned, the new methods of increasing fertility among older women, it helps individuals, but demographically, it's still peanuts compared to the rest.
Okay.
I mean, the doctors would say, oh, no, it's this and that. It is a big revolution on the medical side. And I know it. I mean, at the VUB, precisely in Europe has been at the front runners of artificial insemination and all of that. And the fertility clinic of the VUB had the reputation of working in that direction. And I, together with my colleague, Dr. De Vrooy, who is the andrologist and gynecologist, we gave seminars together, and I gave the demographic one first, and in the next hour and a half was his talk, and that was, of course, exclusively about this tiny proportion of people who could be helped. And that proportion is increasing, but demographically, it's not going to be of any basic help.
Well, Eduardo Rios Neto just posted a question. I hope it's the last one. We are over time. He asked you, we are left with earthling new fluctuations around way below replacement fertility?
Say again?
He asked, regarding the inverted U-shape below replacement fertility, there's a rising segment is puzzling him, especially after you deconstruct the standard explanation. So are we left with earthling new fluctuations around way below replacement fertility? That's his question of Eduardo Rios Neto.
Yeah, that is a possibility. It's an open question. We have only had one wave. So we don't know whether it will be a second wave or a third wave. We can only tell that in the future. But it's a question I just put on the table because we had a fluctuation in Europe, in the whole of Europe, not in Asia, but in the whole of Europe. In Asia, no, it's been rock bottom and stays there. But we had this the decline until 2000, 2010, an increase in 2010 to 2018, 19, pre-COVID, a decline. And now, after COVID, not during COVID, but after COVID, an even steeper decline. Even in those who said that they were immune to that sort of fertility decline. Scandinavia, France, America, USA.
Yeah, Sweden is a good example of it. After 2010, fertility is far below replacement level and it's not coming back. Even with all the gender equality policies. So, Ron, I think we are over time. I appreciate the audience and the questions that everyone posed. I am quite, once again, honored to have you here, to take the time to explain and to give a very nice presentation. That was the last of the year for us. And so I thank you again. I hope to see you soon, if I'm Belgian. And I hope you like it, our seminar and our questions that we posed to you.
One more little thing. Can you give the participants my email address?
Sure.
So if they have questions that they could not pose now, they can always send it in or just contact me for whatever other service I may be able to provide, like sending a paper or something like that. By email, things go so fast and are so easy. So they are very, very free to contact me by email if they have any issues or questions left.
Oh, thank you. So thank you so much, Ron. Have a nice evening.
Okay.
See you.
Hasta luego, as they say.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.